When I was 22 years old, holding a terrifying cancer diagnosis that required $50,000 to save my life, my mother looked at her diamond watch and told me they simply could not afford it. Because my older sister's dream wedding to a man from a wealthy white family was costing $150,000, and the invitations had already been sent out. I walked out of that hospital alone, taking on massive debt to survive, and completely erased them from my life. 10 years later, they walked into my skyscraper begging for a $15 million bailout for their bankrupt company. They needed my signature to survive. What they did not know was exactly whose desk they were standing in front of. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace. Trust me, you will want to hear exactly how this revenge unfolds. It was a freezing Tuesday morning when the doctor handed me the folder containing my death sentence. Early stage cancer. It was treatable, but the specific aggressive treatment I needed was going to cost $50,000 out of pocket. I was a broke college student working 2 jobs just to pay rent. I had no savings, and my basic health insurance would not cover the specialized care I desperately required. So I called my parents. My parents, Richard and Valerie, owned a highly successful medical equipment distribution company called Legacy Med. We were the picture-perfect, affluent African-American family, or at least that is the image my parents fiercely protected. The reality was that my parents were obsessed with social climbing and status. My older sister Vanessa was their golden child because she was willing to play their shallow games. She was engaged to Julian, a white man who constantly bragged about his old money heritage. My parents worshipped Julian, believing his last name was their golden ticket into elite social circles. I sat on the sterile paper of the examination table, my hands shaking violently as I held the diagnosis. The heavy wooden door clicked open, and my parents walked into the small hospital room. They did not rush over to hug me or tell me everything was going to be all right. My mother Valerie stopped a few feet away, keeping her distance so her expensive silk blouse would not touch anything. She sighed heavily, pulling back the sleeve of her coat to check her diamond watch. "Jada, we really do not have time for this drama today," my mother said, her voice dripping with extreme annoyance. "You told us on the phone that you need $50,000. Do you have any idea how selfish it is to ask for that kind of money right now?" I stared at her, stunned by her coldness. "Mom, I have cancer," I whispered, tears spilling over my eyelashes and running down my cheeks. "The doctor said if I do not start this specific treatment program by next month, it could spread. I just need a loan. I will pay you back every single cent once I recover." My father, Richard, stepped forward, crossing his arms over his custom-tailored suit. He looked down at me with an expression of pure calculating irritation rather than parental concern. "We cannot mortgage our assets or pull cash from the company right now, Jada," he stated firmly. "Vanessa's wedding to Julian is in 3 months. The wedding is costing us $150,000. We absolutely cannot embarrass Julian's family by downsizing the event to pay your medical bills." I felt the air leave my lungs. "You are choosing a wedding over my life?" I asked, my voice cracking under the crushing weight of their ultimate betrayal. My mother rolled her eyes and let out an exasperated breath. "Stop playing the victim, Jada," she snapped. "You are young and resilient. Just use the cheap state insurance and go to a public clinic. This marriage is our family's one and only ticket into the upper echelon of society. We have worked our entire lives to reach this level of prestige, and we are not going to let your sudden illness sabotage Vanessa's big day." They were looking at me not as a daughter fighting for her life, but as a financial inconvenience standing in the way of their social climbing. The intense fear I felt about the cancer evaporated and was entirely replaced by a white-hot, blinding rage. I had no family. I never truly did. I was simply a prop in their perfect picture, and right now I was ruining the aesthetic. I slowly stood up from the examination table. I picked up the thick stack of papers and tore them in half right in front of their faces. Then I tore them again, letting the pieces fall to the cold linoleum floor. "You are absolutely right," I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm whisper. "It was selfish of me to interrupt your precious social calendar. Do not worry about my treatment. And do not worry about me ever ruining your perfect family image again." I grabbed my cheap canvas backpack and walked straight past them toward the heavy door. "Jada, where do you think you are going?" my father demanded, his voice echoing in the hallway. I simply did not stop. I did not turn around. I walked out of that hospital entirely alone. I took on crippling debt to pay for my own treatments. I fought the cancer in complete isolation while they drank expensive champagne at Vanessa's wedding. I survived and I built an absolute empire. I initiated strict no contact and vanished from their world completely. But exactly 10 years later, fate would inevitably bring them right back to my doorstep, begging for their miserable lives. 10 years is a massive amount of time when you spend every single waking hour building a legacy from absolute scratch. I took the anger, the betrayal, and the suffocating medical debt, and I weaponized all of it. I worked day and night surviving on pure spite and an unbreakable will to succeed. I founded Apex Health Partners, a venture capital firm specifically designed to acquire, restructure, and dismantle failing medical companies. My company grew into a multi-billion-dollar empire housed in a towering 60-story glass skyscraper right in the financial district. I wore bespoke tailored suits. I commanded boardrooms filled with ruthless executives, and I never looked back at the family that left me to die. But the universe has a specific sense of humor. While I was quietly acquiring hospitals, my parents' beloved company Legacy Med was bleeding out. They had handed the financial reins over to my arrogant brother-in-law Julian, who claimed to be an absolute genius in corporate strategy. Instead, he systematically ran their distribution network straight into the ground. They were completely bankrupt, drowning in massive debt, and desperately searching for a $15 million corporate bailout just to keep their warehouse doors open. Their frantic search brought them directly to my front door. It was a rainy Thursday morning when the stars finally aligned. I was standing in the grand lobby of the Apex Health Partners headquarters, reviewing a digital tablet with my head of security. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern wealth featuring imported Italian marble floors, soaring 40-foot glass ceilings, and a massive cascading indoor waterfall. I was wearing a razor-sharp charcoal gray power suit tailored perfectly to my frame, with a single subtle diamond lapel pin. I felt entirely untouchable. My security chief stepped away to attend to a minor issue, leaving me standing near the center of the room. Then the heavy revolving glass doors spun and they walked right into my kingdom. My older sister Vanessa and her husband Julian stepped onto the pristine marble floor, shaking the rain from their coats. I stood perfectly still watching them take in the sheer intimidating opulence of my building. Vanessa was wearing a bright pink designer coat, her hair styled into a tight, perfect blowout. But the illusion of her elite status was visibly cracking. The designer handbag she was clutching so desperately was from a collection released 5 years ago, and Julian's supposedly custom suit was ill-fitting and worn at the cuffs. They looked like two desperate actors pretending they still belonged on a stage they had been kicked off of long ago. They were trying to project wealth and power, but all I saw was profound desperation. Vanessa's eyes scanned the massive lobby, searching for the main reception desk, and then her gaze landed directly on me. She completely froze in her tracks. For a split second, I saw genuine shock register on her face. She had not seen me in a decade. The last time she looked at me, I was a sick, broken 22-year-old girl begging for my life. Now I was a stunning, powerful 32-year-old woman radiating absolute authority. But the shock quickly melted away and was instantly replaced by the exact same toxic, arrogant smirk she had worn on the day she tried on her expensive wedding dress. Her deeply prejudiced mind simply could not process the idea that I could ever be more successful than her. so her brain automatically fabricated a pathetic narrative that fit her incredibly narrow worldview. Well, look what we have here, Vanessa announced, her voice echoing loudly across the quiet marble lobby as she strutted directly toward me, her high heels clicking sharply against the stone. Mom and Dad told me you dropped off the face of the earth, Jada. We all assumed you were living in some tiny cheap apartment struggling to pay off those medical bills. But look at you playing dress up in a fancy corporate lobby. What exactly are you doing here? Jada, are you a receptionist or just a lowly assistant fetching coffee for the ultra-rich men who actually run this place? I kept my expression entirely blank, my hands folded elegantly in front of me. The sheer audacity of her assumption was almost comical. She was standing inside a billion-dollar skyscraper that I owned from the concrete foundation all the way to the rooftop helipad, and she honestly believed I was standing near the door to greet visitors. Julian stepped up right beside her, looking me up and down with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. He adjusted his cheap silk tie and let out a loud, arrogant scoff. "Vanessa, do not waste your breath talking to the help," Julian warned, waving his hand dismissively in my direction as if swatting away an insect. "We are here for a highly confidential executive meeting with the partners of this firm. We are securing a massive $15 million corporate buyout today, and we do not have time to catch up with your estranged little sister." He turned his attention back to me, his eyes cold and full of that familiar toxic superiority that my parents worshipped blindly. "Listen to me very carefully," Julian ordered, taking a step closer and aggressively invading my personal space. "My wife and I have a scheduled meeting on the top floor. Since you clearly work here in some pathetic entry-level capacity, you are going to make yourself useful for once in your miserable life." He actually raised his hand and snapped his fingers directly in my face twice. "Go find the nearest executive kitchen and fetch me a black coffee. Make sure it is hot. And get Vanessa a sparkling water with a slice of lemon. Do it quickly. And maybe I will not tell your boss how terribly unprofessional you look standing around doing absolutely nothing." I stared at his raised hand and looked directly into his desperate eyes. Any normal person would have lost their temper. They would have screamed the truth right then and there, kicking them out onto the rainy street. But I was an apex predator, and my prey had just willingly walked into my cage, demanding that I lock the door behind them. If I exposed myself now, they would run away and try to scam some other firm. I needed them to sit down at my boardroom table and legally hand over every piece of leverage they had left. I needed to let them build their pathetic house of cards as high as possible before I crushed it. I let a small, apologetic smile form on my lips, perfectly playing the role of the intimidated little sister. "Right away, sir," I replied, my voice soft and subservient. "I will get your drinks immediately." Vanessa let out a triumphant laugh, linking her arm through Julian's as they marched past me. It felt intoxicating to watch them dig their own graves right on my marble floor. I walked toward the private executive lounge located just off the main lobby. Inside, my private barista was wiping down the espresso machine. I waved him off, stepping behind the counter to pour the black coffee and sparkling water myself. My hands were perfectly steady. 10 years ago, my hands would have shaken in the presence of my sister and her arrogant husband. 10 years ago, their cruel words would have shattered my entire week. But standing there in my tailored suit pouring coffee into a disposable cup, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating thrill. They had walked directly into the lion's den, and they were demanding that the lions serve them a beverage. I placed the cup of black coffee and the glass of sparkling water with a lemon slice onto a small silver tray. I took a deep breath, letting the mask of the subservient, estranged sister fall perfectly into place before I walked back out into the massive glass lobby. Vanessa and Julian were sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the guest waiting area. Vanessa was busy taking photos of the soaring ceiling on her phone, probably planning to post them online to pretend she routinely conducted business in such wealthy environments. Julian was nervously tapping his expensive leather shoes against the marble floor, looking at his watch every 10 seconds. He was sweating slightly, a clear physical sign of a man whose financial life was entirely on the line. I approached their table silently and placed the silver tray down in front of them. "Here are your beverages," I said, keeping my voice quiet and perfectly measured. Julian snatched the coffee cup without even looking at me or offering a single word of thanks. He took a sip and immediately grimaced. "It is lukewarm," he complained, setting the cup down on the glass table with a loud thud. I swear the work ethic of entry-level employees these days is pathetic. Vanessa picked up her sparkling water and took a dainty sip, offering me a look of pure pity. "You really should try to do better, Jada," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You are lucky. A prestigious company like Apex Health Partners even hired you. You do not want to lose this job just because you cannot manage simple tasks. Mom and Dad would be so embarrassed if you ended up entirely unemployed and begging them for money again." The absolute irony of her statement almost made me break character and laugh right in her face. She was sitting in my building lecturing me about unemployment, while her husband was literally moments away from begging my company for millions of dollars just to avoid total bankruptcy. I simply nodded, keeping my eyes lowered, acting exactly like the defeated woman they desperately needed me to be. "I apologize," I said softly. "I will try to be more efficient. Is there anything else you need before your scheduled meeting?" Julian let out a heavy sigh and stood up from the velvet sofa, smoothing the front of his worn suit jacket. "Actually, yes, there is something else," he stated, his tone shifting from annoyed to deeply demanding. He reached down and picked up a thick, heavy manila folder from the coffee table. He stepped right into my personal space and forcefully shoved the thick corporate file directly into my chest. I instinctively brought my hands up to catch the heavy folder before it hit the floor. "Take this file directly to your boss," Julian ordered, looking down his nose at me. "This is the confidential financial portfolio for Legacy Med. We have a meeting scheduled for tomorrow to finalize a $15 million corporate bailout, but I am a busy man, and I do not have time to wait around for bureaucratic red tape. I need this loan approved and expedited today. Tell your boss to review these documents immediately, and use whatever little influence you have as his secretary to put in a good word for us. Tell him we are a highly lucrative acquisition." I looked down at the thick manila folder resting heavily in my hands. The Legacy Med corporate logo was printed boldly on the front cover. I slowly opened the cover just a fraction of an inch to glance at the top page of the executive summary. My eyes quickly scanned the printed numbers and the profit and loss margins. It only took my highly trained analytical brain 3 seconds to completely comprehend the horrific financial state of my family company. The numbers were an absolute disaster. Legacy Med was not just struggling, it was a sinking ship on fire. Julian had completely drained their operating capital, accumulated massive unpayable debts, and driven their supply chain into total ruin. They were bleeding cash at an unprecedented rate. The $15 million loan he was demanding was not an investment. It was a desperate lifeline thrown to a drowning man. I closed the folder and looked back up at Julian. He was standing there with his chest puffed out, entirely convinced that he was a brilliant corporate strategist. He had absolutely no idea that he had just forcefully handed the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Health Partners the exact legal and financial documents needed to completely dismantle his entire life. He was literally handing me the keys to their destruction and ordering me to turn the lock. A genuine smile finally broke through my carefully crafted subservient mask. It was not a warm smile. It was the sharp, calculated smile of a predator who had just successfully cornered its prey. I held the heavy folder tightly against my chest, feeling the incredible weight of my impending revenge. "I would be absolutely delighted to pass this directly to the CEO. Julian," I said, my voice smooth and dripping with a dark, hidden meaning. "I will make sure the boss sees every single detail of your financial history. I guarantee you this file will get the exact attention it truly deserves." Julian smirked, completely missing the lethal undertone in my voice. See that you do, he commanded, turning his back on me. We expect exceptional service. I turned around and walked away, carrying their financial death warrant directly up to my penthouse office. The trap was officially set, and the countdown to their total annihilation had just begun before I could even reach the sleek silver doors of the private executive elevator. The heavy revolving glass doors at the front of the massive lobby spun a second time. I paused and turned around, holding the thick manila folder tightly against my chest. Walking through the grand entrance were two people I had not laid eyes on in a decade. My parents, Richard and Valerie, had finally arrived. They stepped onto the imported Italian marble floor, looking around the soaring glass atrium with wide eyes, trying desperately to mask their absolute awe with an air of sophisticated boredom. My mother, Valerie, was wearing a heavy tweed suit that looked entirely outdated, clutching a designer handbag that had clearly seen better days. My father, Richard, walked right beside her, wearing a dark tailored suit that was attempting to hide the physical toll that intense financial ruin had taken on his aging body. They spotted Vanessa and Julian sitting on the velvet sofa and immediately started walking toward them. But then my mother's eyes shifted and locked directly onto me. She stopped dead in her tracks, causing my father to bump into her shoulder. She stared at me for a long, heavy moment, trying to reconcile the memory of the sick, broken 22-year-old girl she abandoned in a hospital room with the powerful 32-year-old woman standing before her in the billionaire lobby. I stood perfectly still, my posture completely straight, waiting to see what kind of horrific narrative she would spin to protect her own fragile ego. She looked me up and down, her eyes scanning the razor-sharp tailoring of my bespoke charcoal gray suit and the subtle diamond lapel pin resting on my collar. She had absolutely no idea that my outfit cost more than her current bank account balance. Her deeply prejudiced mind simply refused to process the reality of my success. She scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as she marched over to where I was standing. Well, look who decided to finally show her face, Valerie said, her voice dripping with that familiar toxic condescension. Vanessa told me on the phone that you were working here as some kind of glorified receptionist. I suppose it makes sense you always lack the drive to do anything meaningful with your life. She reached out and flicked her manicured finger against the lapel of my expensive suit, letting out a short, cruel laugh. You are just as unpolished as you were 10 years ago. Jada wearing a plain gray suit in a building like this. You look like a complete amateur. You really need to learn how to dress for the environment you are in if you ever want to get promoted out of the lobby. I looked at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold hollow. Pity she was standing in the middle of a financial crisis, about to lose everything she had ever owned, and yet her only priority was trying to make me feel small so she could feel big. I did not defend my outfit. I did not tell her that the plain gray suit was hand-stitched in Milan, specifically for my exact measurements. I simply let her bask in her own pathetic delusion. I am doing my best to fit in, Valerie, I replied, keeping my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. The sound of her first name leaving my lips caused her to visibly flinch. She was used to demanding total respect, and calling her by her first name was a quiet, subtle reminder that she had lost the right to be called my mother. A long time ago. My father, Richard, stepped forward, pushing past his wife to stand directly in front of me. He pointed a thick finger right at my face, his expression hardening into a look of pure, arrogant intimidation. Listen to me very carefully, Jada, Richard demanded, his voice low and threatening. We are here to secure a massive financial deal with the top executives of this firm, a deal that will save our company and preserve the family legacy. Julian has worked tirelessly to get us this meeting, and I will not tolerate you ruining it for us. Do not give Julian any of your typical attitude. Do not speak out of turn, and do not do anything to embarrass us in front of your wealthy bosses. He leaned in closer, his breath smelling like stale coffee and overwhelming desperation. You owe this family a favor for raising you, he hissed. Putting a roof over your head and putting food on your plate was not free. Jada, we made sacrifices for you, so the absolute least you can do right now is be a good little assistant and push this paperwork through to the people who actually matter. Do your job properly, and maybe I will forgive you for running away and cutting us off all those years ago. The absolute audacity of his words echoed in my mind. He was actually standing there demanding a favor for raising me, completely ignoring the fact that he had left me to die of cancer because he wanted to pay for a wedding. He believed I owed him a debt of gratitude for simply keeping me alive during my childhood, while he was actively trying to use me to save his own miserable failing business. The sheer level of narcissistic entitlement was staggering, but I did not let a single ounce of anger show on my face. I knew that any reaction would only feed their twisted egos. They wanted me to argue. They wanted me to cry. They wanted me to fight back, because it would validate their belief that they still had emotional control over me. Instead, I simply took a slow, deliberate step backward, creating a physical and psychological distance between us. You have made yourself very clear, Richard, I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. I will make sure this corporate file is placed directly into the hands of the Chief Executive Officer. I will make sure every single page of your financial history is scrutinized, exactly the way you want it to be. Julian will get exactly the level of attention he deserves. From the leadership of this firm, my father offered a smug, satisfied nod, completely oblivious to the lethal double meaning behind every single word I had just spoken. Good, he grunted, adjusting his tie. Now get back to work and stay out of our way. We have real business to conduct. He turned around and walked back toward his golden child Vanessa and his fraudulent son-in-law Julian. Leaving me standing alone near the elevators, I watched the four of them huddle together on the velvet sofa, looking around the grand lobby like they had already conquered the world. They were completely drowning in debt, utterly bankrupt, and seconds away from losing their entire fake upper-class existence. But in that exact moment, they felt like royalty. I turned on my heel and stepped into the private glass elevator, pressing the button for the top floor, as the doors slid shut, blocking their pathetic faces from my view. I looked down at the heavy manila folder in my hands. The trap was fully armed and they had just willingly locked themselves inside just as the private elevator began its ascent. I realized I needed to grab a specific legal addendum from the secondary records room on the mezzanine level to properly process their financial death warrant. I pressed the button, stopping the car, and stepped out into the quiet, dimly lit corridor. The mezzanine was a restricted area reserved exclusively for senior executives. The thick carpets absorbed the sound of my footsteps. I was alone with my thoughts, holding the heavy manila folder containing the Legacy Med bankruptcy details, when I heard the sudden sharp clicking of leather shoes rushing up the nearby marble staircase. Someone had followed me up from the grand lobby. I turned around just as Julian rounded the corner. His breathing was slightly heavy from climbing the stairs, and his eyes were darting around the empty hallway checking for security guards. Of course, he missed the tiny black domes seamlessly mounted into the ceiling corners. He cornered me near the elevator bank, physically blocking my path back to the glass doors. Jada. Wait a second, Julian whispered harshly, stepping directly into my personal space. His face was flushed and he reeked of cheap cologne and profound desperation. I need to talk to you in private before you hand that folder over to your boss. I stood perfectly still, my expression entirely blank, maintaining the illusion of the intimidated little sister. What is it, Julian? I asked, keeping my voice soft. My father told me to deliver this file immediately. I do not want to get in trouble. He let out a condescending scoff and waved his hand dismissively. Your boss can wait 5 minutes, he snapped, looking over his shoulder again to ensure the corridor was still empty. Listen to me very carefully. The $15 million corporate bailout is absolutely crucial for the family business. But between you and me, it is simply not enough cash to cover the long-term strategic deficits we are currently facing. I need a secondary revenue stream to ensure that Legacy Med returns to its elite status. And since you work in this building, you are going to help me secure it. I tilted my head slightly, feigning total ignorance. How exactly can an assistant help you secure more funding? Julian, I asked innocently. Julian leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made my skin crawl apex. Health Partners is the most aggressive medical venture capital firm in the state, he explained, his eyes gleaming with a toxic mixture of greed and sheer arrogance. Your executives acquire failing hospitals every single week. They have a massive database of confidential bidding data and know exactly how much rival firms will pay for distressed assets. I need you to log into your portal. Use your access credentials and download the internal bidding strategies for the upcoming quarter. I widened my eyes, pretending to be absolutely terrified by his sudden bold demand. Julian, you want me to steal highly classified corporate data? I gasped, clutching the manila folder tighter against my chest. I could get fired for even attempting to access those files. They monitor everything we do on the network. Stop being such a pathetic coward, Julian hissed aggressively, grabbing my upper arm. His grip was tight and painful, an obvious attempt to physically intimidate me into submission. You are a lowly secretary. Nobody is going to notice if you slip into the system and download a few spreadsheets onto a flash drive. There is a highly lucrative corporate black market for this exact type of insider information. I have private buyers lined up who will pay millions to know exactly what Apex Health is planning to bid. On the next string of hospital acquisitions, you are going to steal that data and hand it over to me tomorrow when we return to sign the bailout paperwork. He reached into the inside pocket of his worn suit jacket and pulled out a small wad of crumpled cash. He forcefully shoved the bills directly into the palm of my hand. It was $500 in $20 bills. Consider this a generous tip for your clerical services. He sneered, a cruel, arrogant smirk spreading across his face. Do this one simple favor for the family, and maybe I will let you attend the company holiday party next year. But if you refuse or tell anyone about this conversation, I will personally ensure your boss fires you before the sun goes down. You will be entirely broke and living on the street. He let go of my arm and took a step back, admiring his own supposed brilliance. He genuinely believed he was a criminal mastermind, manipulating a weak, uneducated woman. He had absolutely no idea that the moment he grabbed my arm, I had subtly pressed the small tactile button on the side of my designer smartwatch. The device instantly activated its high-definition audio recording feature, capturing every single word of his illegal proposal directly to my encrypted secure server. I stood there, looking down at the $500 in my hand, feeling an overwhelming sense of dark, cold victory. Julian had just escalated his situation from a simple corporate bankruptcy to committing blatant federal corporate espionage and wire fraud on tape. I will see what I can do, Julian, I whispered, keeping my head bowed so he could not see the lethal smile forming on my lips. Good girl, he said, patting my shoulder patronizingly. Do not mess this up, Jada. He turned around and strutted back toward the marble staircase heading down to the grand lobby to rejoin his oblivious wife and my delusional parents. I watched him disappear around the corner, my smartwatch silently ending the recording and uploading the irrefutable evidence of his federal crimes directly to my legal team. He came into my building looking for a $15 million lifeline, but he just handed me the rope I needed to hang him after Julian disappeared down the stairs. I made my way to the top floor of the Apex Health Partners skyscraper. The doors of the private elevator opened directly into my master executive suite. It was a sprawling masterpiece featuring panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the financial district. My massive desk was carved from a single piece of rare black walnut. I usually kept the double doors securely locked, but my assistant had propped them open. I walked softly across the plush custom rug, clutching the Legacy Med manila folder. As I approached the entrance to my private office, I heard the faint sound of high heels clicking against the hardwood floor inside. Someone was trespassing in my personal space. I stopped in the doorway and looked inside. My older sister Vanessa was standing right in the middle of my office. She had sneaked away from the guest waiting area downstairs to snoop around the top floor. She obviously assumed she had successfully infiltrated the office of the mysterious billionaire, CEO, I supposedly worked for. She walked over to the private lounge area near the corner window. Her eyes immediately locked onto the centerpiece resting on a small marble pedestal. It was a limited edition Hermes Birkin bag, crafted from rare Himalayan crocodile skin with diamond-encrusted hardware. It was a highly exclusive piece that cost exactly $80,000. Vanessa's mouth dropped open when she saw it. She looked over her shoulder to make sure the office was empty completely, failing to notice me standing quietly in the shadows of the doorway. She ran her manicured fingers over the textured, exotic leather. I could see the pathetic gears turning in her shallow mind. She had a prestigious high society gala to attend this weekend, and her own designer bags were noticeably worn. Without hesitation, my golden child sister casually picked up the $80,000 Birkin bag and seamlessly slid the handle over her shoulder. She turned toward the large mirror, admiring her reflection, posing as if she actually owned the breathtaking piece of luxury. She took a step toward the exit, fully intending to simply walk out of the building with stolen property. I stepped out of the shadows and stood directly in the center of the doorway, completely blocking her path. "What exactly do you think you are doing, Vanessa?" I asked, my voice cold and flat. Vanessa physically jumped, startled by my sudden appearance. She clutched the crocodile Birkin bag tightly against her chest, her face flushing a deep shade of crimson as she realized she had been caught red-handed. But just like our parents, Vanessa possessed an endless supply of arrogant delusion. She instantly shifted into a defensive posture. She rolled her eyes and let out a dramatic, irritated sigh. "Oh, relax, Jada," she scoffed, waving her free hand dismissively. "I was just exploring the top floor while Julian and Dad review their notes downstairs. Your boss has incredibly good taste in accessories, I must admit. I am going to borrow this bag for a charity gala on Saturday night. It perfectly matches the aesthetic I am going for." I stared at her in absolute disbelief. "You are attempting to steal an $80,000 limited edition handbag from a private executive office, and you are calling it borrowing," I stated, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "Put the bag back on the pedestal right now." She let out a harsh, mocking laugh and took a step closer, trying to use her status as the older sister to intimidate me. "Do not be so incredibly dramatic and petty, Jada," she sneered, looking down at my suit. "Your boss is a literal billionaire. He probably buys these things for his mistresses every other week. He will not even notice that one bag is missing. Just look the other way and do your job. You are a lowly secretary. You do not dictate what I can or cannot take. Besides, our family is about to secure a $15 million deal with this firm, so technically we are elite business partners. You should be treating me with a lot more respect." She tried to shoulder her way past me to reach the elevator. I did not move a single muscle. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my encrypted two-way security radio. I pressed the transmission button and spoke directly to the chief of security on the ground floor. "Intercept the woman in the pink coat on the top floor," I commanded, my voice unwavering and completely authoritative. "She is in possession of stolen high-value property. Send a security escort to the penthouse immediately." Vanessa's arrogant smirk vanished. The blood drained from her face as the reality of my words set in. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she shrieked, her voice cracking with sudden panic. "You cannot call security on your own sister. You pathetic snitch. Mom and Dad are going to be furious with you." I looked her dead in the eye, feeling a deep coldness in my chest. "You have exactly 10 seconds to put the bag down before the armed guards step off that elevator and place you in handcuffs," I told her. "My boss has a zero-tolerance policy for thieves, especially arrogant ones." Vanessa trembled with pure humiliation. She practically threw the $80,000 Birkin bag onto the nearest leather sofa, her chest heaving with angry, frantic breaths. "You are just a bitter, jealous loser abusing your tiny amount of borrowed power," she hissed, her eyes filled with toxic hatred. "You are nothing but a glorified maid playing watchdog for rich people." The elevator doors chimed behind me, signaling the arrival of the security team. Vanessa pushed past me, fleeing the office in absolute disgrace. She still firmly believed I was just a lowly assistant wielding my boss power. But she had just learned that even the assistant could completely destroy her fake elite facade. Vanessa brushed past the two massive armed security guards who had just stepped off the private elevator, keeping her head down in absolute sheer humiliation. I raised my hand and silently signaled the guards to simply escort her back down to the ground floor and ensure she did not wander into any other restricted executive areas. I watched the elevator doors close on her flushed, panicked face, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. I walked over to the leather sofa, picked up the crocodile Birkin bag, and carefully placed it back onto its marble pedestal. Then I walked over to my massive black walnut desk and finally sat down in my high-backed leather chair. I placed the heavy manila folder Julian had forcefully given me onto the smooth glass surface and opened the cover. I spent the next 30 minutes meticulously combing through the internal financial records of Legacy Med. The numbers were significantly worse than I had initially realized from my quick glance down in the grand lobby. Julian had completely systematically destroyed a company that took my parents 30 years of hard work to build. He had inflated his own executive salary, paid for exorbitant personal expenses, using corporate accounts, and completely ignored massive unpaid vendor invoices. But the most glaring fatal issue staring back at me from the red-stained balance sheets was the absolute lack of collateral. Legacy Med had zero liquid assets remaining. Their warehouse equipment was entirely outdated and already heavily leveraged against previous defaulted bank loans. Their supply chain contracts were completely voided due to months of non-payment. They were marching into Apex Health Partners, asking for a massive $15 million corporate bailout. But they had absolutely nothing of value to offer in return to secure the funding. No legitimate financial institution in the entire country would ever approve a high-risk, entirely unsecured loan of this magnitude. Julian and my parents were walking directly into a solid brick wall, and their toxic arrogance blinded them to the reality of their impending doom. I closed the folder and pushed it aside. But before I could even take a deep breath, the heavy double doors of my office swung open for a second time. This time, it was my father, Richard. He had somehow managed to slip away from my mother and Julian in the guest waiting area and aggressively talked his way past the floor reception desk. He probably used his booming, pastoral-sounding, authoritative voice and claimed he had an urgent family emergency to discuss with his daughter. He walked into my executive suite, looking around the sprawling, opulent room with a mixture of deep intimidation and intense, calculating greed. He obviously still firmly believed this was the office of my mysterious billionaire boss, and he was trying to assess the immense wealth of the man I supposedly worked for. Richard spotted me sitting behind the massive black walnut desk. He marched directly toward me, his face flushed with a desperate, panicked, frantic energy. He did not bother to ask how I was doing or apologize for Vanessa's highly embarrassing behavior with the security team earlier. He simply stopped right in front of my desk, leaning his heavy frame forward, and slammed a single crisp sheet of paper down onto the glass surface right next to the Legacy Med file. "Listen to me very carefully, Jada," he commanded, his voice low and tight with overwhelming anxiety. "Julian just informed me that there might be a minor bureaucratic issue with the collateral requirements for the $15 million bailout. He claims the banking algorithms these days are simply too strict, and our assets are currently tied up in complex offshore investments that cannot be easily verified. We need an internal corporate guarantor to completely bypass the risk assessment protocol and push the final approval through the executive stages today." He tapped his thick, heavy finger aggressively against the piece of paper he had just slammed on my desk. This is a legally binding corporate guarantor form. You are going to use your employee credentials and your internal security clearance to personally co-sign and guarantee this high-risk loan. You work directly for this billionaire CEO, so your signature carries significant internal weight. You are going to put your personal name and your employment on the line to secure this critical funding for the family. I looked down at the blank piece of paper and then looked slowly up into my father's cold, demanding, desperate eyes. He was actually demanding that I chain myself to his sinking ship. He wanted me to assume $15 million of his toxic debt just because we shared the same last name. I am not signing a corporate guarantor form for a completely unsecured loan. Richard, I replied, keeping my voice perfectly flat and entirely devoid of any emotion. My father leaned further across the glass desk, his face twisting into an ugly, terrifying mask of pure narcissistic rage. He was not used to me ever saying no to him. If you do not sign this piece of paper right now, I will personally march right into your boss's private office and tell him exactly who you are. He threatened viciously, his voice dripping with pure venom. I will tell him that you are a common thief and an incredibly ungrateful daughter who stole thousands of dollars from her own family years ago just to pay for a fake illness. I will tell him you are completely untrustworthy, unstable, and a massive liability to his prestigious firm. Let us see if you keep your little job then, Jada. Let us see how you survive when you are thrown out onto the freezing street with absolutely nothing to your name. He honestly believed he held all the power in the room. He genuinely believed his toxic parental authority and his fabricated lies could force me to commit complete financial suicide just to save his failing public image. I sat perfectly still in my high-backed leather chair, staring at him for a long, heavy, silent moment. I let the silence stretch deliberately until the arrogant, confident smirk on his aging face began to waver ever so slightly. I did not blink, and I did not break eye contact. Then I slowly reached out and picked up the guarantor form from the glass desk. I held the crisp white paper up between my hands, maintaining direct, piercing eye contact with my father. With a slow, deliberate, and incredibly satisfying motion, I tore the paper straight down the middle. The sharp sound of the ripping paper echoed loudly in the quiet executive office. My father gasped loudly, his eyes widening in absolute sheer shock, as if I had just physically struck him across the face. I placed the two torn halves together and tore them again, ripping his desperate final lifeline into useless quarters. I held my hands out over the edge of the black walnut desk and opened my fingers. I let the shredded pieces of paper flutter softly to the floor, watching them land right on top of his expensive, worn leather shoes. I did not say a single word. I just let him stare at the destroyed document, realizing that his threats meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. He stood there completely paralyzed by my blatant defiance, unable to comprehend how the weak, sick girl he had discarded 10 years ago had suddenly become completely immune to his manipulation. He opened his mouth to shout at me, but no words came out. He was suffocating on his own toxic arrogance, and I was more than happy to sit back and watch him struggle for air. My father Richard stood there staring at the torn pieces of paper on his expensive shoes for what felt like an eternity. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words that simply would not come. The absolute shock of my refusal had completely short-circuited his arrogant brain. He finally managed to let out a low, pathetic growl of frustration. He turned around and stormed out of my private executive suite without looking back, leaving the heavy double doors to close softly behind him. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling the residual tension leave my shoulders. I was not afraid of him anymore, but the sheer toxicity he brought into my space was exhausting. The moment the doors clicked shut, the hidden side door leading to my private adjoining conference room opened quietly. Miles walked into the office holding a sleek silver tablet. Miles was not just my fiancé, He was the most brilliant corporate mergers and acquisitions attorney in the entire state and the lead legal counsel for Apex Health Partners. He was wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, his dark eyes sharp and entirely focused. He had been listening to the entire exchange through the secure audio feed in the next room. He walked over to my black walnut desk and placed a warm, comforting hand on my shoulder, leaning down to press a soft kiss against my temple. "You handled that flawlessly, my love," he murmured, his voice deep and grounding. He is completely desperate, and he has absolutely no idea that he just threatened the sole owner of the building. I leaned into his touch for a brief second before pulling the heavy manila folder back to the center of the desk. "The emotional games are over, Miles," I said, looking up at him. "It is time to look at the actual math." Julian handed me this file downstairs, demanding an expedited approval for their $15 million bailout. Miles let out a dark, humorless chuckle and pulled up a chair, sitting right beside me. He tapped the screen of his tablet, syncing it to the secure server, where my artificial intelligence auditing software had already been quietly scanning the financial documents Julian provided. "Well, let us see exactly how deep the golden child and her fraudulent husband have buried your parents, Miles," said, his fingers flying across the digital keyboard. We spent the next hour doing a massive deep dive into the Legacy Med financial portfolio. What we found was not just standard corporate mismanagement or bad business decisions. It was a sickening display of deliberate malicious theft. Miles pulled up a hidden secondary ledger that his software had managed to extract from the metadata of Julian's poorly scrubbed files. Julian had not just bankrupted the medical supply company, he had been actively bleeding it dry for years. The money was not lost in bad investments or failed supply chain contracts. It was systematically siphoned into a complex web of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. "Look at this sequence right here." Miles pointed to a series of massive wire transfers highlighted in red on his tablet screen. Julian has been wiring hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the corporate operating fund every single month for the last 3 years. I tracked the routing numbers to a series of high-stakes international gambling syndicates and private offshore casinos. Your brother-in-law is not a failed businessman, Jada. He is a degenerate gambler who used your parents' entire life savings as his own personal casino chip. I sat back in my leather chair thinking about the cold hospital room 10 years ago. My mother had checked her diamond watch and told me that $50,000 to save my own life was simply too much of a financial burden. They told me I was selfish for asking them to delay a wedding to pay for my cancer treatments. Yet they had handed over the entire keys to their legacy to a white man simply because he promised them access to country clubs and elite social circles. Julian had taken their blind trust and burned millions of dollars at blackjack tables and roulette wheels across the globe. They sacrificed their own flesh and blood to protect an image that Julian had just gambled away entirely. I stared at the screen, feeling a cold wave of disgust wash over me. My parents worshipped Julian because he claimed to be from old money. They let him completely control their legacy because they were blinded by their own pathetic social climbing prejudice. And he had repaid their blind loyalty by robbing them entirely blind. But the absolute worst part was yet to come. Miles swiped to the next page of the digital audit and his expression turned incredibly grim. He pulled up a series of highly confidential legal documents that he had pulled directly from the County Registry of Deeds. "Jada, it actually gets much worse." "Miles," said, his voice dropping to a serious professional tone. "Julian knew the company was completely insolvent 6 months ago. To keep up the illusion of wealth and to fund his escalating gambling addiction, he needed a massive influx of untraceable cash. Since the company had zero assets left to leverage, he went after the only thing your parents still actually owned: their sprawling luxury estate." Miles enlarged the document on the screen. It was a legally binding contract for a massive high-interest second and third mortgage on my parents' house. At the bottom of the document was my father's signature. But I knew my father's handwriting perfectly. The signature on the screen was a sloppy, frantic forgery. Julian secretly forged Richard's signature, Miles explained, pointing to the discrepancies in the ink strokes. He took out loans against their private residence to cover his offshore debts. The loans defaulted 90 days ago. Julian has been intercepting the mail and hiding the legal notices from your parents. I felt the air leave the room as the sheer magnitude of the betrayal fully registered in my mind. My parents were currently sitting downstairs in my lobby wearing their expensive, outdated clothes, looking down their noses at everyone around them, entirely convinced they were elite members of high society. They were demanding bailouts and threatening my job, believing they still held the keys to a multi-million-dollar kingdom. They had absolutely no idea that their golden son-in-law had completely destroyed them. The bank had already initiated active foreclosure proceedings. The massive iron gates of their sprawling estate were going to be padlocked by the county sheriff by the end of the week. My parents and my cruel sister Vanessa were literally days away from being entirely homeless, and they did not suspect a single thing. The net was now fully drawn, and the trap was perfectly secured. Julian had brought them to my firm hoping to use Apex Health Partners to secure one final fraudulent loan to cover his tracks and flee the country. Instead, he had walked his entire family directly into the ultimate execution chamber. I looked at Miles and offered a slow, cold smile. Print out the final liquidation documents and the asset seizure forms, I instructed, my voice steady and completely void of mercy. Prepare the executive boardroom for tomorrow morning. It is time to let them pitch their little business proposal to the chief executive officer. I left my private executive office and took the elevator back down to the ground floor to finalize the security protocols for the upcoming day. The grand lobby was beginning to empty out as the late afternoon rain continued to wash over the massive glass windows of the financial district. As I walked across the imported Italian marble floor, I saw them. My family was lingering near the revolving glass doors. They were huddled together, adjusting their coats and putting on a pathetic display of fake wealth for the passing employees. Julian spotted me approaching and immediately broke away from the group. He marched directly into my path, intentionally blocking my way to the security desk. He was practically vibrating with a toxic mixture of arrogant pride and petty vindictiveness. His earlier panic from our hallway conversation had been completely replaced by a smug, sickening confidence. He stopped inches away from my face, looking down at me with an expression of pure disgust. "Well, Jada," he began, his voice loud enough to echo across the quiet lobby. "Your father told me about your little temper tantrum upstairs, tearing up a corporate guarantor form just to spite your own family. You really are as pathetic and bitter as you were 10 years ago. But it does not matter anyway. I just got off the phone with one of the senior vice presidents of this firm. He assured me that the paperwork has been expedited and the chief executive officer will personally sign off on our $15 million bailout tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock sharp." I kept my expression entirely blank, my hands folded neatly in front of me. I did not tell him that the senior vice president he spoke to was actually just my automated legal intake team stringing him along exactly as I had instructed. I simply let him bask in his fabricated victory. Julian leaned in closer, his breath smelling of stale mints and undeniable greed. "And when the real CEO walks into that boardroom tomorrow," Julian hissed, his voice dripping with pure malice, "the very first thing I am going to do is tell him exactly what a disrespectful, insubordinate little secretary you are. I am going to make sure he knows you tried to sabotage a multi-million-dollar acquisition because of your petty personal jealousy." Vanessa strutted over, linking her arm through Julian's and offering me a look of profound pity. "You really blew it, Jada," she sneered, adjusting the collar of her pink coat. "You had one chance to prove you were actually useful to this family, and you chose to be a bitter, jealous loser. Mom and Dad are completely done with you. When Julian gets you fired tomorrow, do not even think about coming to our house to beg for a place to stay. You are going to be thrown out on the street exactly where you belong." My parents stood a few feet away, watching the entire exchange with cold, indifferent eyes. My mother adjusted her worn designer handbag and looked at her diamond watch, exactly the way she had in that hospital room, completely dismissing my existence. My father offered a slow, arrogant nod, validating Julian's cruel threats. They were entirely convinced that tomorrow morning would bring their ultimate salvation and my absolute destruction. I looked at the four of them standing there completely drowning in an ocean of invisible debt. They were mocking me while wearing clothes bought with stolen money, living in a house that was actively being foreclosed upon by the bank. The sheer, breathtaking irony of their arrogance was almost beautiful. I did not defend myself. I did not raise my voice or offer a single threat. I simply offered them a polite professional nod. I completely understand, Julian. I replied, my voice soft and perfectly measured. I will make sure the boardroom is prepared for your arrival tomorrow morning. The CEO is very much looking forward to meeting you and discussing the exact details of your financial portfolio. I suggest you get a good night's sleep. Julian let out a loud, mocking laugh and pushed his way past me, intentionally bumping his shoulder against mine. See you tomorrow, Secretary, he mocked over his shoulder. They walked out through the revolving glass doors, stepping out into the freezing rain and disappearing into the crowded city streets. I watched them go, feeling a deep, profound sense of calm wash over my entire body. The final pieces were locked into place. The board was set, and the countdown to checkmate had officially reached its final hours. I left the skyscraper and took my private town car back to my luxury penthouse overlooking the city skyline. The penthouse was my personal sanctuary, a massive, sprawling space filled with modern art. I walked directly into my master bedroom and opened the heavy wooden doors to my walk-in closet. It was time to select my armor for tomorrow. I bypassed the plain gray suits and the muted corporate colors. Tomorrow I was not playing the role of the invisible assistant. Tomorrow, I was the executioner. I reached out and pulled a custom-tailored haute couture suit off the velvet rack. It was a breathtaking piece crafted from pristine, stark white silk wool blend with razor-sharp lapels and a silhouette that commanded absolute undeniable authority. It was the kind of suit that screamed billionaire power. I laid the pristine white suit carefully across my massive bed and walked over to my home office. Miles had sent a secure courier with the physical documents we had drafted earlier. A thick stack of heavy premium parchment paper rested on my mahogany desk. I sat down and turned on the small brass desk lamp illuminating the bold black text printed across the top of the pages. Notice of hostile takeover. Total asset liquidation. Immediate seizure of corporate and personal property. These were not bailout forms. They were the legal death certificates for Legacy Med and Julian's entire fraudulent life. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a heavy brass custom ink stamp. I pressed the stamp firmly into the bright red ink pad. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the crushing weight of the last 10 years pressing against my chest. The rejection in the hospital room, the crushing medical debt, the years of work, all of it had led to this exact, singular moment. I aligned the brass stamp over the bottom of the first document and pressed down with all my strength. The loud, satisfying thud echoed in the quiet penthouse. I lifted the stamp, revealing a massive, bold red seal that read, "Denied and slated for liquidation." I stamped the next page and the next until the document bore the undeniable mark of their absolute ruin. I stacked the papers neatly into a sleek black leather portfolio. I turned off the desk lamp and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the glittering lights of the city. They wanted to see the real CEO tomorrow. They wanted me thrown out on the street. I smiled a slow, cold smile in the dark glass reflection. Tomorrow morning, the golden child and her arrogant husband were going to learn exactly who owned the street. The morning of Judgment Day broke with a cold, brilliant sunlight piercing through the massive panoramic glass windows of the Apex Health Partners skyscraper. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my penthouse, smoothing the pristine white silk wool blend of my custom haute couture suit. The fabric draped perfectly across my shoulders, radiating an undeniable aura of absolute power and untouchable wealth. I did not wear a single piece of jewelry other than my simple diamond engagement ring. I did not need flashy accessories to prove my status the way my sister and mother so desperately did. My power was entirely inherent and completely authentic. I picked up the sleek black leather portfolio containing the red stamped liquidation documents and walked out the door. My private driver took me the short distance to the office, and I rode the secure executive elevator directly to the top floor. The top floor of the building was entirely dedicated to the massive glass-enclosed VIP boardroom. It was an intimidating architectural masterpiece designed specifically to make visiting corporate officers feel small and entirely insignificant. The walls were completely transparent, offering a breathtaking vertigo-inducing view of the entire city skyline. A massive rectangular table carved from a single slab of dark mahogany dominated the center of the room, surrounded by 20 plush leather executive chairs. My senior vice presidents and top-tier banking executives were already seated around the table, reviewing their digital tablets and speaking in hushed professional tones. Miles was standing near the head of the table wearing his sharp navy blue suit, his expression entirely stoic and fiercely focused. At exactly 10 o'clock, the heavy frosted double doors of the boardroom swung open. My family strutted into the room like they were royalty, gracing the peasants with their divine presence. Julian led the pack, his chest puffed out to a ridiculous degree, wearing a different suit that was equally as cheap and poorly tailored as the one from yesterday. Vanessa was right beside him, wearing a bright yellow designer dress that was entirely inappropriate for a serious corporate acquisition meeting. She clutched a different handbag, obviously trying to compensate for the extreme humiliation she suffered in my office the day before. My parents, Richard and Valerie, trailed close behind them, their faces plastered with smug, arrogant smiles. They looked around the massive glass room, their eyes widening at the sheer opulent display of wealth, but they quickly forced their expressions into looks of bored familiarity. Julian immediately began working the room. He walked right up to my chief financial officer, a brilliant older man named Harrison, and aggressively shook his hand. "Good morning, gentlemen," Julian announced loudly, completely ignoring standard corporate etiquette. "I am Julian, the strategic director of Legacy Med, and these are the principal owners, Richard and Valerie. We are incredibly pleased to be here today to finalize our $15 million partnership with your firm. Your chief executive officer has excellent taste in real estate, but we are going to show him how to really maximize his return on investment." Harrison simply nodded politely, exchanging a brief, knowing look with the other executives at the table. They all knew exactly what was about to happen today. They had all read the horrifying financial audit, and they knew all about the forged mortgages and the offshore gambling debts. But they played their parts perfectly, allowing Julian to dig his grave even deeper. Vanessa leaned over the mahogany table, offering a fake bright smile to the executives. "We are just so thrilled to merge our elite family legacy with your capital," Vanessa boasted, her voice dripping with fake sophistication. "My husband has completely revolutionized our supply chain, and we are ready to take this entire industry by absolute storm." My mother Valerie chimed in, adjusting her pearl necklace and smoothing her skirt. "Yes, we have a long-standing tradition of excellence in our family," Valerie added, her voice echoing loudly off the glass walls. "We only associate with the absolute best in the business. It is simply how we operate in our prestigious social circles." They were parading their fabricated wealth and their fake status right in front of the very people who held the legal documents, proving they were completely and utterly bankrupt. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was breathtaking. They actually believed they had successfully fooled a room full of the most ruthless venture capitalists in the entire city. I timed my entrance perfectly. The heavy frosted doors opened silently, and I stepped into the glass boardroom. The pristine white silk of my suit caught the brilliant morning sunlight flooding through the panoramic windows. My footsteps were entirely silent against the thick custom rug as I walked over to the far corner of the room, placing myself intentionally in the shadows away from the massive mahogany table. I stood perfectly still, holding the black leather portfolio against my side, simply watching the pathetic spectacle unfold before my eyes. It took them a few minutes to even notice I was in the room. They were too busy bragging to the silent executives to pay any attention to their immediate surroundings. But then my mother Valerie turned around to find a comfortable seat, and her eyes locked directly onto me. Her arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer furious indignation. She stared at my pristine white haute couture suit, her deeply prejudiced brain completely short-circuiting. She could not comprehend how the daughter she had cast aside could afford an outfit that radiated such undeniable wealth and absolute power. Her face turned an ugly shade of red as she marched directly toward the corner where I was standing. "What in the world are you doing in here?" Valerie hissed, her voice low and full of venom, trying desperately not to draw the attention of the banking executives sitting nearby. She stopped a few feet away from me, pointing a shaking manicured finger right at my face. "Get out, Jada," she commanded aggressively. This is a closed-door executive meeting to finalize a massive multi-million-dollar corporate merger. This is not a place for secretaries or entry-level assistants to stand around and eavesdrop on important conversations. My father Richard noticed the sudden commotion and quickly walked over, standing right beside his angry wife. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated rage. "I told you yesterday to stay out of our way," Richard muttered through clenched teeth. "Julian is about to secure the $15 million bailout, and you are standing here trying to ruin our focus with your pathetic presence. If you do not leave this room right now, I will personally demand that your boss fires you the exact second he walks through those frosted doors." Vanessa and Julian turned around to see exactly what was holding up the important meeting. Vanessa scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes dramatically when she saw me standing in the corner. "Oh my God, Jada, you are so incredibly desperate for attention," Vanessa mocked, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You are literally just a glorified maid. Stop trying to pretend you belong in a room with actual successful people. Go fetch us some hot coffee and wait out in the hallway before you embarrass yourself even further." Julian let out a harsh, cruel laugh, shaking his head in mock pity. "Let her stay," Vanessa Julian sneered, looking me up and down with absolute profound disgust. "I want the little secretary to watch exactly how real business is done. I want her to see what a true genius looks like when I secure this massive lucrative deal for the family she selfishly turned her back on 10 years ago." I did not say a single word. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I simply stood there in the corner of the magnificent glass boardroom, holding the black leather portfolio containing their absolute destruction. I let their toxic insults wash over me, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of cold calculation. I was a predator patiently watching my prey walk willingly into the slaughterhouse. I did not move a single inch. I just waited for the final act to begin. The room settled into a heavy, expectant silence, as my refusal to leave the corner was simply ignored by the incredibly arrogant family standing before me. My mother Valerie let out a disgusted huff, turning her back on me and taking her seat next to Richard in the plush leather chairs reserved for the presenting clients. Vanessa sat gracefully smoothing her yellow designer dress and crossing her legs, offering a sickeningly sweet smile to the senior vice presidents. Julian, however, did not sit down. He unbuttoned his cheap suit jacket and walked confidently to the front of the massive mahogany table standing directly beneath the high-definition projection screen. He looked out over the room of brilliant financial minds, completely oblivious to the fact that every single person sitting at that table had already read the forensic audit, detailing his massive offshore gambling debts. Miles sat near the head of the table, his hands folded neatly over his digital tablet, his face an absolute mask of professional indifference. Julian cleared his throat and offered a wide, charismatic smile, the kind of completely fake smile that had charmed my parents into handing over the keys to their entire legacy. Thank you all for taking time to meet with us this morning. Julian began, his voice projecting loudly across the glass boardroom with practiced ease. Legacy Med has been a cornerstone of the medical supply distribution network for over 30 years. But today, we are not here to talk about the past. We are here to talk about a highly lucrative, incredibly aggressive future. He clicked a small remote in his hand, and the massive screen behind him illuminated with a series of brightly colored charts and upward trending graphs. The numbers displayed on the screen were an absolute work of fiction. They were so entirely fabricated that it bordered on sheer comedy. Julian paced back and forth across the front of the room, waving his hands dynamically as he delivered his entirely fraudulent pitch. He spoke about revolutionary supply chain logistics, untapped international markets, and unprecedented profit margins. He threw around complex corporate buzzwords like synergistic integration and paradigm-shifting asset management, trying desperately to sound like a seasoned Wall Street titan. What Apex Health Partners is looking at today is not just a simple corporate bailout. Julian continued, his voice rising with theatrical passion. The $15 million we are requesting is a strategic capital injection that will allow us to unlock millions of dollars in highly complex offshore investments. We have secured exclusive vendor contracts that are currently pending final capitalization. Once your funds clear, our escrow account's Legacy Med will essentially quadruple its operational capacity within the first quarter alone. You are not just saving a company, gentlemen. You are buying into the ground floor of an absolute monopoly. I stood in the quiet corner of the room, my black leather portfolio resting against my side, listening to him openly lie to a room full of federal witnesses. He was pitching his massive gambling losses as strategic offshore investments. He was selling voided vendor contracts as exclusive lucrative deals. The Apex executives sitting around the table did not blink. They did not ask any questions or interrupt his passionate monologue. They simply watched him with cold, analytical eyes, letting him dig the hole so incredibly deep that he would never be able to climb out. But the most sickening part of the entire presentation was not Julian and his pathetic lies. It was the reaction of my family sitting at the table. I watched my father staring up at his son-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated worship. His eyes were shining with actual tears of absolute pride. He genuinely believed every single fabricated word coming out of Julian's mouth. He saw a brilliant financial savior, a man who was going to hand him a $15 million check to sustain his fake wealthy lifestyle. My mother Valerie was completely captivated, her hands clasped tightly together over her chest, as if she were witnessing a religious miracle. She was already spending the money in her mind, planning her next country club gala and her next unnecessary luxury vacation. She looked at Julian with the kind of deep, unconditional love and respect she had never once shown to her own daughter. Vanessa sat beside them, practically glowing with toxic arrogance, looking around the room to ensure the banking executives were properly mesmerized by her supposedly genius husband. They were entirely convinced that they had won. They believed they had successfully scammed a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm and that their elite status was permanently secured. Julian brought his presentation to a dramatic close, bringing his hands together in a sharp, powerful clap that echoed through the glass boardroom. The final slide on the massive screen displayed the Legacy Med logo hovering above a grossly inflated fictional valuation. "So, gentlemen," Julian concluded, leaning forward and placing both of his hands flat on the polished mahogany table, locking eyes with Miles. "The due diligence has been completed. The numbers speak entirely for themselves, and the future is incredibly bright. We have done our part. Now it is time for your firm to do yours. We were told the paperwork was fully expedited and approved. We are ready to finalize this partnership right here and right now. Please bring in your chief executive officer so we can sign the authorization check and begin this incredibly profitable journey together. Julian stood up straight, buttoning his cheap suit jacket, back up and flashing a triumphant, arrogant smirk. My family immediately erupted into a round of enthusiastic applause, clapping loudly for the man who had secretly bankrupted them and forged their signatures on a doomed mortgage. The sheer magnitude of their delusion had finally reached its absolute peak. They were standing on the edge of a massive cliff, cheering loudly as Julian ordered them to take a blind step off the ledge. The scattered applause from my parents and sisters slowly died down, echoing weakly against the massive glass walls of the boardroom. Julian remained standing at the front of the room, his chest puffed out with absolute toxic pride, waiting for the heavy frosted doors to swing open and reveal his fictional savior. He genuinely expected an older white billionaire to walk in and hand him a $15 million check. The senior vice presidents and top-tier executives sitting around the mahogany table did not clap. They simply closed their digital portfolios and turned their attention to the head of the table where Miles was sitting. The silence in the room grew heavy and incredibly thick. It was the kind of heavy silence that precedes a massive, devastating storm. My father, Richard, shifted uncomfortably in his plush leather chair, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, but entirely unable to comprehend what it meant. My mother. Valerie checked her diamond watch again, a nervous habit she had carried for decades whenever she felt she was losing control of a room. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly over her yellow designer dress, looking impatiently toward the closed doors. Julian cleared his throat, his arrogant smirk wavering just a fraction of an inch as the silence stretched on for several excruciating seconds. Well, Julian prompted, his voice losing a bit of its theatrical booming quality. As I said, we are ready to finalize this lucrative partnership. Please bring in the chief executive officer so we can sign the authorization check. Miles slowly stood up from his leather executive chair at the head of the table. He buttoned his tailored navy blue suit jacket with absolute calm precision. He looked at Julian and then swept his dark, piercing eyes over my parents and my sister. A slow, sharp smile formed on Miles' face. It was a smile that held absolutely no warmth. It was the smile of a brilliant corporate attorney who was about to drop a massive legal guillotine directly onto their necks. Thank you for that incredibly illuminating presentation, Julian Miles said, his voice deep and echoing with pure, undeniable authority. The financial projections you just displayed were certainly creative. Your entire family has made their expectations very clear. You are here to meet the person who owns this building, the person who built this multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm from the ground up, and the person who holds the ultimate absolute power over your $15 million request. My father leaned forward in his chair, his eyes wide with desperate, greedy anticipation. Vanessa sat up completely straight, ready to flash her most charming fake smile at the approaching billionaire. Julian turned slightly toward the frosted glass doors, ready to aggressively shake the hand of the man he planned to scam. But Miles did not look at the heavy frosted doors. He did not gesture toward the hallway. Instead, Miles turned his body completely and looked directly into the quiet, shadowed corner of the glass boardroom. He looked directly at me. Ladies and gentlemen, Miles announced, his voice rising in volume and echoing powerfully off the panoramic windows. Please stand and welcome the founder, the chief executive officer, and the chairman of the board for Apex Health Partners, Miss Jada. The reaction was instantaneous and entirely breathtaking. Every single senior vice president, every top-tier banking executive, and every financial analyst sitting around the massive mahogany table immediately stood up from their plush leather chairs in absolute perfect unison. The sound of 20 chairs sliding back simultaneously echoed loudly in the quiet room. They turned their bodies toward the corner where I was standing and lowered their heads in a deep, profound display of genuine corporate respect. They were honoring the woman who signed their massive paychecks, the woman who orchestrated their hostile takeovers, and the woman who had single-handedly built the empire they all served. I took a slow, deliberate step out of the shadows. The brilliant morning sunlight caught the pristine white silk wool blend of my custom haute couture suit, illuminating me like a physical manifestation of absolute untouchable power. I held the sleek black leather portfolio containing their liquidation documents loosely at my side. My footsteps were slow, steady, and completely silent against the thick custom rug as I began my long, highly anticipated walk across the massive glass boardroom. Every single eye in the room was locked entirely on me. The powerful executives watched me with unwavering loyalty, while my family watched me with a rapidly escalating sense of total, undeniable doom. The sheer, absolute shock that instantly paralyzed my family was something I will remember for the rest of my life. The room completely froze. All the oxygen was violently sucked out of the air, leaving them gasping like fish thrown onto a dry dock. Julian stood at the front of the room, his arrogant smile completely wiped away, leaving his mouth hanging open in a pathetic display of sheer, dumbfounded terror. His eyes darted frantically from Miles to the standing executives and then finally locked permanently onto me. His brain was violently misfiring, unable to process the words Miles had just spoken. He had ordered me to fetch him black coffee yesterday. He had shoved $500 into my hand and demanded that I steal corporate secrets for him. He had threatened to have me fired and thrown out on the street. And now, he was realizing that he had directed all of those pathetic criminal threats at the actual billionaire who held his entire miserable life in the palm of her hand. My mother, Valerie, stopped breathing entirely. She stared at me as I walked past her chair, her face turning a sickening shade of ash gray. Her expensive makeup suddenly looked like a clown mask melting under the harsh reality of the moment. The daughter she had just ordered to leave the room, the daughter she had called an unpolished amateur and a lowly secretary, was currently being bowed to by a room full of the most powerful financial minds in the city. My father, Richard, gripped the heavy wooden armrests of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned completely white. His arrogant demands and his deep toxic pride were completely shattered in a single defining moment. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. He realized with absolute horrifying clarity that the $15 million he so desperately needed to save his fake upper-class existence was controlled entirely by the child he had left to die in a cold hospital room 10 years ago. He was at my absolute mercy, and he knew deep down in his rotten soul that I possessed absolutely none. Vanessa let out a tiny, pathetic gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling, manicured hands. She sank back into her plush leather chair, looking as if she had just been physically struck. The $80,000 crocodile Birkin bag she had tried to steal from my office yesterday actually belonged to me. The massive glass skyscraper they were sitting in belonged to me. She was sitting in a room surrounded by actual billionaires, and she had just realized that her estranged little sister, the girl she had spent her entire life stepping on to elevate herself, was the absolute king of them all. Her yellow designer dress suddenly looked incredibly cheap in the blinding light of my absolute success. I did not look at any of them as I walked the remaining length of the massive mahogany table. I kept my chin held high, my expression entirely blank, and my posture radiating ultimate unyielding authority. I reached the head of the table where Miles was standing. He pulled out the massive primary executive chair for me, offering a deep, respectful nod. I turned around and slowly took my seat at the absolute head of the board. The executives remained standing in perfect silence until I was fully seated, and then they all sat down in perfect, flawless unison. The sound of the chairs sliding back into place was the only noise in the entire room. I placed the sleek black leather portfolio onto the polished mahogany surface right in front of me. I folded my hands, resting them gently on top of the black leather. The silence in the glass boardroom was now absolutely deafening. It was a silence so heavy it felt like physical pressure crushing the lungs of the four people sitting at the opposite end of the room. I looked directly down the length of the table, locking eyes with Julian, who was currently sweating profusely and gripping the edge of the acrylic podium just to keep his trembling legs from completely collapsing beneath him. The real chief executive officer had finally arrived, and the absolute execution of their entire fraudulent legacy was officially about to begin. The heavy silence in the room stretched so far, I thought the thick glass walls of the boardroom might actually shatter from the sheer pressure. Julian was the first one to physically break under the immense weight of the truth. His knuckles were completely white as he gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium, trying desperately to keep his legs from giving out. He opened his mouth, but the charismatic booming voice he had used just minutes ago was entirely gone. A pathetic squeaking sound escaped his throat, followed by a series of fragmented, stuttering syllables. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. "But you," he stammered, his eyes darting wildly between my face and the faces of the senior executives sitting around the table. You were in the lobby, you brought us coffee." His mind simply refused to process the reality that the woman he had treated like a peasant was the absolute undisputed queen of the corporate chessboard. The memory of him shoving $500 into my hand and demanding that I commit federal corporate espionage was visibly crashing down on his arrogant brain. He realized he had attempted to bribe the owner of the firm to steal her own confidential data. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I let him drown in his own overwhelming cognitive dissonance. My eyes shifted from his sweating, panicked face to my mother, Valerie. The blood had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant woman who had strutted into my building. She raised a trembling hand to her throat, clutching her pearl necklace so tightly the string looked ready to snap. Her breath was coming in short, shallow gasps as the memories of her cruel insults from the lobby violently crashed into her current reality. She had called me an unpolished amateur. She had demanded I leave the room because it was not a place for secretaries. And now she was sitting in a plush leather chair inside my multi-billion-dollar skyscraper, realizing that she was entirely at my absolute mercy. My father, Richard, looked as though he had suddenly aged 20 years in the span of 30 seconds. The proud posture he had carried into the room completely collapsed. He slumped forward, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and profound, sickening regret. He had threatened to have me fired. He had demanded that I use my employee credentials to co-sign his high-risk unsecured loan. He had tried to use his toxic parental authority to force me into submission, completely unaware that he was barking orders at the apex predator of the entire financial district. The sheer devastating humiliation of his actions washed over him, visible in the way his shoulders violently shook. He had handed me the manila folder containing his complete financial ruin and ordered me to execute it. And then there was Vanessa, my golden child sister who had spent her entire existence using my pain as a stepping stone for her fake elite status. She was shrinking back into the leather chair, trying to make herself as small as physically possible. The yellow designer dress she wore suddenly seemed like a glowing beacon of her own pathetic superficiality. She looked at my pristine white custom haute couture suit and then down at her own trembling hands, her mind violently replaying the moment she tried to steal my $80,000 crocodile Birkin bag. She had told me I was a bitter, jealous loser playing watchdog for rich people. Now she understood that I was not the watchdog. I was the owner of the entire estate. I reached forward and pressed the small silver button on the base of the sleek microphone positioned in front of me on the mahogany desk. The tiny LED ring around the microphone glowed a cool, sharp blue, indicating that my voice would now be projected through the state-of-the-art audio system embedded in the boardroom ceiling. I leaned in slightly, bringing my lips close to the microphone. The sound of my slow, steady breathing echoed through the room, sending a visible physical shiver down Julian's spine. "Did you really think I was a secretary?" I asked, my voice cold, flat, and cutting through the air like a razor blade sliding over solid ice. The amplified sound of my voice made my father physically flinch. Did you honestly believe that I spent the last 10 years fetching coffee and taking notes for someone else? I paused, letting the rhetorical questions hang in the heavy, suffocating air. You walked into my headquarters and assumed I was a lowly assistant, because your deeply prejudiced, narrow minds could never comprehend a world where the discarded scapegoat daughter became the ultimate titan of industry. I leaned back in my primary executive chair, keeping my eyes locked dead onto my trembling parents. You chose a $150,000 wedding over my life. I stated the absolute truth of their betrayal, echoing off the glass walls for all the senior executives to hear. You looked at your diamond watch, Valerie, and told me that $50,000 to cure my cancer was simply too much of an inconvenience for your pathetic social climbing agenda. You told me to use cheap state insurance and left me in that cold hospital room to die. A collective murmur of sheer disgust rippled through the top-tier banking executives sitting around the table. They were ruthless corporate raiders, but even they had a moral baseline. And the revelation of my parents' horrifying cruelty completely repulsed them. My mother squeezed her eyes shut, tears of absolute ultimate shame finally spilling over her lashes and ruining her expensive makeup. But I did not die. I continued, my voice rising in volume and power, filling every single corner of the massive glass boardroom. I fought that cancer entirely alone, taking on massive crippling medical debt just to survive. And when I was finally cured, I took the pennies I had left to my name, and I built this entire empire with my bare hands. I did not have a wealthy family legacy to lean on. I did not have an arrogant white husband to forge signatures and steal money for me. I built Apex Health Partners on pure, relentless strategy and an unbreakable will to never be at the mercy of toxic, manipulative people ever again. I gestured gracefully around the magnificent room, sweeping my hand to encompass the multi-billion-dollar skyline visible through the panoramic windows. Every single inch of this skyscraper belongs to me, I declared, looking directly at Julian, who was now weeping silently behind the clear acrylic podium. The executives in this room report exclusively to me. The bank accounts you are desperately trying to access are controlled entirely by me. You came here seeking a $15 million lifeline from a mysterious billionaire to save your fraudulent, bankrupt lives, and you never once stopped to realize that you were begging for salvation from the very girl you threw away. The absolute devastation on their faces was a masterpiece of poetic justice. The entire foundation of their fake old money aesthetic was completely pulverized, reduced to fine dust beneath the heel of my white silk suit. They were stripped of every single delusion they had ever harbored. They were forced to sit under the blinding harsh lights of reality and acknowledge that the golden child had married a parasitic criminal while the discarded sick daughter had conquered the entire financial world. The trap had snapped entirely shut, and there was absolutely no escape from the brutal, undeniable truth. I let the crushing weight of their ultimate realization settle over the room for a few more seconds before I turned my attention back to the man sweating behind the acrylic podium. Julian was shaking so violently that the clear plastic of the stand was visibly rattling against the mahogany table. He had walked into my building expecting to scam a mysterious billionaire out of $15 million, but instead he had walked directly into a meticulously crafted execution chamber designed specifically for him. I looked over at Miles, who was sitting perfectly still with his hands resting on his digital tablet. I gave him a single sharp nod. Miles tapped the smooth glass surface of his screen, and the massive high-definition projector behind Julian instantly shifted. The brightly colored fabricated charts and the fake upward trending graphs completely vanished. They were immediately replaced by the harsh, glaring reality of the Legacy Med financial audit. The screen illuminated with complex spreadsheets highlighting massive red deficits and a sickening web of unauthorized wire transfers. The sheer volume of the stolen money was staggering to look at. Julian turned around to look at the screen and let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. He stumbled backward away from the podium, his expensive leather shoes scraping loudly against the thick custom rug. My father Richard leaned forward in his plush leather chair, squinting at the complex financial data displayed on the wall. His eyes darted back and forth, trying to make sense of the massive negative numbers and the offshore routing codes that were completely foreign to his supposed elite business acumen. What you are looking at, Richard, is the actual financial legacy of your brilliant son-in-law, I announced, my voice echoing coldly through the microphone. Julian did not revolutionize your supply chain or secure highly lucrative international vendor contracts. He systematically drained every single cent from your corporate operating fund. He wired millions of dollars into complex offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands to feed a massive degenerate gambling addiction. He spent the last 3 years burning your entire life savings at high-stakes roulette tables and international casinos while smiling in your faces and pretending to be a financial genius. My father let out a loud, tortured gasp, clutching his chest as if he had just been shot. He looked at Julian with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Julian shook his head frantically, raising his trembling hands in a pathetic attempt to deny the irrefutable evidence displayed brightly behind him. "It is a lie," Julian stuttered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. "She is manipulating the data to frame me because she is jealous of our family. Do not listen to her, Richard. She is just a bitter, vindictive liar." I did not even bother to raise my voice to counter his pathetic screaming. I simply looked at Miles again. Miles tapped his tablet a second time. The massive screen shifted from the financial ledgers to a simple black audio waveform graphic. The state-of-the-art surround sound speakers embedded in the ceiling of the glass boardroom crackled to life. The crisp, clear audio of the recording I had captured on my smartwatch yesterday afternoon began to play at maximum volume. Julian's own arrogant voice echoed through the room, completely destroying any remaining shadow of a doubt. The audio played his exact words, detailing how Apex Health Partners was the most aggressive medical venture capital firm in the state. The entire room listened in absolute stunned silence as the recorded version of Julian demanded that I log into the secure portal and steal highly classified corporate bidding data. They heard him openly admit that he planned to sell the stolen internal strategies on the corporate black market to rival firms for millions of dollars. And finally, they heard the sickening sound of him shoving $500 into my hand, offering it as a generous tip for my clerical services before threatening to have me fired and thrown out on the street if I refused to commit federal corporate espionage. The audio recording clicked off, leaving a deafening heavy silence in its wake. The reaction from the top-tier banking executives sitting around the mahogany table was absolute visceral disgust. The chief financial officer, Harrison, pushed his chair back from the table, shaking his head in profound revulsion. The other senior vice presidents stared at Julian as if he were a diseased rat that had somehow crawled onto their pristine, polished table. They were seasoned Wall Street veterans who dealt with ruthless corporate raiders every single day, but the sheer brazen stupidity and malicious criminal intent of Julian's plan was entirely repulsive to them. Julian was completely trapped. His face turned a sickly shade of pale gray, and he looked around the room like a cornered animal desperately searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. He looked at Vanessa, hoping his loyal golden wife would somehow defend him, but Vanessa was curled into a tight ball in her leather chair, openly sobbing into her hands, entirely destroyed by the public humiliation. My parents were completely frozen, staring blankly at the floor as their entire fabricated universe violently imploded. "You came into my headquarters looking for a $15 million lifeline," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying whisper that cut through the silence like a scalpel. "But instead, you handed me the exact rope I needed to hang you." The timing was absolutely impeccable. The heavy frosted double doors of the boardroom violently burst open, hitting the glass walls with a loud booming thud that made everyone in the room physically jump. A team of 8 Federal Bureau of Investigation agents marched directly into the room. They were dressed in dark tactical suits, their federal badges gleaming brightly under the modern chandelier. Their heavy boots stomped rhythmically against the pristine floor, cutting a straight, completely undeniable path directly toward the front of the room. Julian let out a blood-curdling scream of pure terror when he saw the agents marching toward him. He tried to scramble backward, but his legs finally gave out, and he collapsed heavily onto the floor right beneath the massive glowing projector screen displaying his massive financial crimes. Two of the largest federal agents instantly descended upon him. They grabbed Julian by the shoulders of his cheap suit and yanked him roughly to his feet, spinning him around to face the wall. Julian, you are under federal arrest for corporate espionage, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The lead agent barked, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking securely around Julian's wrists echoed loudly across the silent boardroom. The sound was incredibly final and entirely satisfying. It was the undeniable sound of his completely fabricated empire crumbling into absolute dust. The lead agent roughly patted him down, while Julian sobbed uncontrollably, tears and sweat streaming down his flushed face, completely ruining his carefully crafted old money image. He was no longer the arrogant financial genius who looked down on people he deemed beneath him. He was just a pathetic, broken criminal wearing steel bracelets crying on the floor of a boardroom he tried to steal from. I sat perfectly still at the head of the mahogany table, watching the entire magnificent downfall with a heart full of absolute perfect peace. The federal agents began marching him aggressively toward the heavy frosted doors. Julian was stumbling, his head hanging low in absolute ultimate disgrace as they paraded him right past the senior vice presidents he had tried to scam just minutes earlier. The arrogant old money facade was entirely permanently destroyed, swept away by the brutal, undeniable force of the truth. I had promised myself 10 years ago in that cold hospital room that I would never be a victim again, and watching the FBI drag my abuser out of my own building was the ultimate fulfillment of that promise. The heavy frosted doors swung shut behind the federal agents, cutting off the pathetic sounds of Julian's sobbing and leaving the massive glass boardroom in a state of stunning, suspended animation. The top-tier banking executives and senior vice presidents were entirely speechless, trying to process the sheer magnitude of the federal sting they had just witnessed. But the heavy silence was violently shattered by a sudden blood-curdling scream. It was Vanessa. She was standing in the exact same spot near the mahogany table, but now she was clutching the sides of her head, her mouth wide open in a scream of absolute hysterical agony. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into her carefully styled hair, ruining the flawless aesthetic she had spent hours preparing for this fabricated victory. She screamed until her voice went completely hoarse, and then she began to aggressively push her way past the empty leather chairs, stumbling blindly toward the head of the table. She stopped right at the edge of the polished wood, looking at me with wild, tear-streaked eyes. Her makeup was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streams, ruining her bright yellow designer dress. "You ruined my life!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged fury. "You did this on purpose! Jada, you set us up to be humiliated in front of the entire corporate board. My husband is going to federal prison, and my entire social standing is completely destroyed. How could you be so incredibly evil and vindictive? You are a monster." I looked down at my older sister, the golden child who had spent my entire existence stepping on my neck to elevate herself. She expected me to feel guilty. She expected the old Jada to apologize and try to fix the massive catastrophic mess her husband had created. I remained perfectly seated in my primary executive chair, my expression entirely, completely devoid of any sympathy or regret. I did not force Julian to commit federal wire fraud. "Vanessa," I said, my voice low, cold and steady enough to freeze boiling water. "I did not force him to bankrupt the company or lie to federal investigators, and I certainly did not force him to bring his massive criminal enterprise into my skyscraper, looking for a quick payout to save his miserable skin. He destroyed his own life, And he took you down with him because you were too busy basking in his fake old money glow to realize you were married to a desperate broke con artist. Vanessa let out a loud dramatic sob, throwing her hands up into the air, trying to play the ultimate victim card. "But I am your sister!" she wailed, looking around the room to see if any of the wealthy executives were taking pity on her. But the board members only stared at her with deep, profound disgust. "I have absolutely nothing left. You have to help me, Jada. You have to tell the federal agents it was a misunderstanding. You have all this money now. You can pay off his debts and save our family." She was still completely delusional, still entirely convinced that her status as the golden child meant she was immune to consequences and entitled to my hard-earned wealth. I let out a slow, humorless laugh that made Vanessa physically flinch. "You do not have a family anymore," I reminded her, leaning slightly closer to her tear-stained face. "And you are right. You have absolutely nothing left. Your designer wardrobe is worthless. Your luxury cars are repossessed, and your husband is facing 15 years behind steel bars. You are broke, Vanessa, completely and utterly bankrupt. But before you try to figure out where you are going to sleep tonight, there is one piece of business we need to conclude right now." I reached out and opened the sleek black leather portfolio resting in front of me. I pulled out the thick stack of legal documents that Miles had extracted from the county registry of deeds. I threw the heavy stack of forged mortgage contracts onto the mahogany table. The papers slid across the smooth, polished wood, stopping right in front of Vanessa's shaking hands. My father, Richard, stood up from his chair, his face a mask of pure terror as he looked down at the legal text he could not comprehend. "Your husband did not just bankrupt Legacy Med," I announced, my voice echoing loudly across the silent room, making sure my horrified parents heard the exact devastating truth. Julian knew the business was entirely insolvent 6 months ago, and he desperately needed untraceable cash to fund his escalating offshore gambling debts. So he secretly forged Mom and Dad's signatures and took out a massive high-interest second and third mortgage on their sprawling luxury estate. The loans completely defaulted 90 days ago, and Julian intercepted all the legal foreclosure notices from the mail. My mother, Valerie, let out a shrill, horrifying shriek, clutching her pearl necklace so hard the string snapped, sending dozens of expensive white pearls clattering loudly across the mahogany table and bouncing onto the floor. My father collapsed back into his leather chair, his mouth opening and closing in silent, suffocating shock as the reality of his complete financial ruin finally crushed him. "That $150,000 dream wedding you had." "Vanessa," I continued, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at the scattered legal documents. "The lavish wedding our parents chose to pay for instead of funding my cancer treatments 10 years ago. You just paid for it with your parents' home. The bank is officially foreclosing, and the county sheriff is padlocking the iron gates of their estate on Friday morning. You are all officially broke and completely, entirely homeless." The revelation hit her like a massive physical blow, the sheer absolute reality of the situation finally piercing through her thick layers of lifelong entitlement. The moment the words left my mouth, Vanessa physically broke. The last remaining symbol of her fake elite status was gone, and the sheer crushing weight of her new reality completely collapsed on top of her. She realized in that exact defining moment that she would be walking out of my luxury skyscraper with absolutely nothing to her name. Her entire identity was built on the foundation of being better than me, and now I owned the building and she was entirely destitute. She was crying inside her knees, completely buckled beneath her, and she dropped heavily onto the thick custom rug right at the base of the mahogany table. She curled her arms around her knees and began to weep hysterically, the ugly, guttural sobs of a woman who had just realized she was entirely, completely alone in the world. She was husbandless, she was homeless, and she was stripped of every single fake luxury she had ever used to make herself feel superior. The golden child was officially permanently shattered, lying in a puddle of scattered pearls and broken dreams. I looked down at her shaking form, feeling absolutely nothing but the cool, satisfying breeze of total closure. Vanessa was weeping on the floor, surrounded by the scattered white pearls. The senior vice presidents and top-tier banking executives remained perfectly silent in their plush leather chairs, watching the absolute destruction of a family that had walked in radiating toxic arrogance just an hour earlier. I shifted my gaze from the broken golden child on the thick custom rug to the two people who were supposed to protect me when I was young. My mother, Valerie, was gasping for air, her hands clutching the torn collar of her expensive blouse, her mind unable to comprehend the sheer mathematical reality of her sudden poverty. She had spent 30 years cultivating an image of flawless high society wealth, and Julian had gambled every single penny of it away in secret offshore casinos. Her sprawling luxury estate with the heated swimming pool and the manicured lawns was permanently gone. Her elite status was entirely evaporated into thin air. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, completely stripped of all the condescending prejudice she had weaponized against me my entire life. My father, Richard, the imposing man who had aggressively cornered me in my own office yesterday and threatened to have me thrown out onto the freezing street, finally lost the remaining strength in his legs. He slowly slid out of his leather executive chair, his knees hitting the rug with a heavy, muffled thud. He was kneeling right beside the scattered forged mortgage documents, his expensive tailored suit wrinkling as his broad shoulders shook with violent, uncontrollable sobs. It was an incredibly pathetic sight. The arrogant patriarch who had always demanded absolute respect and complete obedience from everyone around him was now begging on the floor of a glass boardroom, completely humiliated in front of the most powerful financial minds in the entire city. He did not care about his pride anymore, because his deep, toxic pride could not pay off a massive $15 million deficit or stop the county sheriff from padlocking his front iron doors. Jada, please, my father, wept, his voice a broken, pathetic rasp that echoed weakly off the panoramic windows. Please, daughter, you have to help us. You have all of this immense power and all of this incredible wealth at your disposal. You can fix this entire nightmare with a single stroke of your pen. We did not know Julian was stealing from us. We swear to you on our lives, we had absolutely no idea he was forging our signatures and ruining the family legacy. You are our flesh and blood, Jada. You are our own daughter. You cannot just sit there and watch your own parents become completely homeless. Please just sign the $15 million corporate bailout and save the family company. Save us, Jada. Please save us from this total disaster. My mother, Valerie, dropped to her knees right next to him, her heavy tweed suit bunching up as she crawled slightly forward on the rug, reaching her trembling hands out toward the smooth mahogany table. Baby, please, Valerie begged, using that sweet, affectionate nickname she only ever used when she desperately wanted something from someone else. We made a terrible mistake 10 years ago. We know that now. We were blinded by the wedding and the extreme social pressures, but we always loved you deep down in our hearts. You proved us entirely wrong. Jada, you became this brilliant, powerful chief executive officer, and we are so incredibly proud of the woman you have become. Please just authorize the funds, and we will make it all up to you. We will be a real happy family again, we promise you. I sat perfectly still in my primary executive chair, looking down at the two people begging for their miserable lives. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of their words was genuinely staggering to witness. They were invoking the sacred concept of family and flesh and blood only now when they were completely, entirely destitute and desperate for cash. When I was 22 years old, sick and terrified in a cold hospital room, begging for $50,000 to save my actual physical life, my status as their flesh and blood meant absolutely nothing to them. I was just a frustrating financial inconvenience ruining their perfect social calendar. My mother had rolled her eyes at my tears, and my father had told me to use cheap state insurance because they could not possibly embarrass Julian's wealthy white family by downsizing a lavish wedding party. They had happily sacrificed my life to buy their way into high society, and now they were begging me to sacrifice my own multi-billion-dollar empire to buy them out of the severe consequences of their own blinding prejudice. The banking executives, sitting around the table, watched the pathetic display with entirely blank analytical expressions. They knew better than to interrupt a hostile corporate takeover led by their chief executive officer. They simply waited in complete silence for my final, absolute verdict. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or sadness as I looked at my parents crying on the floor. The sick young girl who would have desperately wanted their validation and their apologies died 10 years ago in that hospital hallway. The powerful woman sitting in the mahogany chair was a seasoned corporate predator, completely immune to their toxic emotional manipulation. Their tears were entirely meaningless to me. They were just drops of salt water falling onto an expensive rug. I kept my face completely devoid of any emotion, locking my cold gaze onto my father's desperate, sweating face. I slowly reached inside the breast pocket of my pristine white custom haute couture suit and pulled out a sleek, heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen. The polished silver hardware of the expensive pen gleamed brightly under the modern glass chandelier. The entire boardroom held its collective breath as I unscrewed the cap with a slow, highly deliberate motion. The soft metallic scraping sound was the only noise cutting through my parents' pathetic sobbing. I looked down at my father, Richard, his eyes widening with a sudden spark of fragile fabricated hope. He actually believed his pathetic begging had worked on me. He genuinely thought I was going to hand over $15 million to the people who left me to die simply because they finally said they were proud of my success. I looked him dead in the eyes, the absolute freezing coldness of my gaze completely suffocating his tiny, pathetic spark of hope. "All right," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and completely unyielding, echoing through the quiet glass boardroom with ultimate absolute finality. "I will sign." My father let out a massive breath of relief, his shoulders dropping as he genuinely believed his pathetic begging had successfully manipulated me. My mother, Valerie, actually smiled a weak, watery smile of pure selfish relief, wiping the ruined makeup from her cheeks. Vanessa stopped her hysterical sobbing on the floor, looking up at the mahogany table with wide, desperate eyes. They all thought the nightmare was finally over. They thought the golden ticket was being handed right back to them by the daughter they had discarded. I lowered the heavy silver Mont Blanc fountain pen to the thick premium parchment paper resting inside the sleek black leather portfolio. The boardroom was so incredibly quiet that the sharp scratching sound of the metal nib gliding across the paper echoed loudly off the glass walls. I signed my name with a massive sweeping flourish, pressing the bright red ink seal of my corporate authority right next to my signature. The ink was dark and permanent, a binding legal execution of my ultimate will. Richard began to push himself up off the thick custom rug, his knees popping as he prepared to stand up and aggressively shake my hand like a triumphant businessman. Valerie was already reaching her trembling fingers toward the edge of the table, waiting for me to slide the $15 million authorization check directly into her greedy hands. But I did not slide the portfolio toward my mother. I did not look at my father. Instead, I closed the black leather cover with a sharp, echoing snap. I picked up the heavy portfolio and handed it directly to Miles, who was standing perfectly still beside my primary executive chair. The sudden movement completely confused my family. My father froze halfway between kneeling and standing, his face twisting in sudden frantic confusion. Miles took the portfolio, his face an absolute mask of cold professional legal authority. He opened the cover and pulled out the crisp white documents I had just signed. Miles cleared his throat, his deep voice completely shattering their fragile, fabricated hope. As the lead legal counsel for Apex Health Partners, It is my corporate duty to formally read this binding executive order into the official record, Miles announced, looking down at the legal text. My parents stared at him, their breathing instantly turning shallow and erratic again. Miles did not look at them. He simply read the words that would permanently end their entire elite existence. This document is not a corporate bailout. Miles read, his voice booming with undeniable finality. This is a formal declaration of a hostile takeover and an immediate total liquidation order. Apex Health Partners has officially purchased all of the defaulted debt previously held by Legacy Med from your offshore creditors. By the executive authority of the Chief Executive Officer, Apex Health is now officially seizing all remaining physical and liquid assets belonging to Legacy Med to cover those massive debts. The corporate entity, known as Legacy Med, is hereby permanently dissolved, effective immediately. All warehouse properties, supply chain contracts, and internal bank accounts are now the sole property of Apex Health Partners. You get absolutely nothing. The words hung in the air like a physical executioner's blade dropping directly onto their necks. The absolute sheer horror that washed over my parents' faces was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Richard dropped back down onto his knees, hitting the floor so hard the impact echoed loudly in the silent room. He let out a guttural sound of pure, suffocating agony. Valerie collapsed entirely against the leg of the mahogany table, her hands pulling frantically at her own hair, her mind completely shattered by the reality of her total absolute destruction. They had walked into my building begging for a $15 million lifeline, and I had just legally swallowed their entire company whole. Their legacy was gone in a matter of seconds. The top-tier banking executives sitting around the table remained perfectly stoic, watching the ruthless corporate acquisition unfold exactly as I had meticulously planned. Vanessa let out another hysterical shriek, burying her face in the rug, realizing that not only was she homeless and husbandless, but her parents could not even afford to buy her a meal, let alone save her fake elite lifestyle. They were entirely bankrupted by the exact same signature they had desperately begged for. I sat perfectly still in my primary executive chair, looking down at the broken, ruined people weeping on the floor of my glass boardroom. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of absolute freedom washing over my entire body. The heavy, dark cloud that had followed me for 10 long years was completely, entirely evaporated. The toxic roots that had tried to strangle me since childhood were permanently severed. I leaned forward slightly, resting my arms on the polished mahogany surface, looking my parents dead in the eyes. The coldness in my gaze was absolute and completely unyielding. The room grew so quiet that the only sound was the pathetic, ragged breathing of the people who had abandoned me. 10 years ago, you stood in a sterile hospital room and looked at your diamond watch. I said, my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any sympathy. 10 years ago, you chose a $150,000 wedding over my physical life. You decided that keeping up your fake social appearances was vastly more important than paying for my cancer treatments. You sacrificed your own flesh and blood to protect an empire built entirely on pathetic lies and toxic arrogance. You thought I was weak, and you thought you would remain powerful forever. My father sobbed louder, reaching his shaking hand out toward me, as if asking for a final shred of mercy. But I did not even flinch. I simply stared at the pathetic, broken man crying on the custom rug. Today, I choose my empire over yours. I declared the final words, echoing powerfully off the panoramic windows, sealing their fate permanently. Your legacy is completely dissolved, your wealth is entirely erased, and your social status is nothing but dust scattered on my floor. You have absolutely nothing left to offer the world, and you have absolutely no place in mine. The execution was entirely complete, and my revenge was absolute perfection. I raised my hand slightly, and Miles pressed a small button on his digital tablet. Less than 5 seconds later, the heavy frosted doors of the boardroom swung open. 6 massive armed security guards stepped into the room, their expressions entirely blank. They marched directly toward the head of the mahogany table where my family was still weeping on the thick custom rug. "Escort these individuals out of the building, Miles," ordered his voice cold and authoritative. "They are officially trespassing. If they resist, you are authorized to use physical force." My mother Valerie let out a loud shriek as two large guards grabbed her by the arms of her expensive tweed suit, pulling her roughly to her feet. "Do not touch me," she screamed violently, thrashing her body back and forth. "I am the mother of the chief executive officer. You cannot do this to me." But her screams echoed uselessly off the glass walls. My father, Richard, tried to weakly shove one of the guards away, but his complete physical exhaustion made the effort entirely pathetic. The guards grabbed him by his lapels and dragged him backward. Vanessa was entirely catatonic, simply letting the security team lift her by her armpits. Her bright yellow designer dress was wrinkled and stained as they hauled her out of the room like discarded trash. Their desperate screaming faded down the long hallway as the secure executive elevator doors closed, shutting them out of my world forever. The top-tier banking executives quietly gathered their digital tablets, offering me deep, respectful nods before silently filing out of the room to execute the massive liquidation orders. I sat alone at the head of the heavy mahogany table. The execution was entirely flawless. 6 months passed in the absolute blink of an eye. The Federal Bureau of Investigation built a bulletproof case against Julian, using the audit data and the audio recording. Julian lacked the financial resources to hire a private attorney, so he was represented by a public defender. The judge showed absolutely no mercy to a man who committed corporate espionage and stole millions of dollars. Julian was sentenced to 15 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. His fake elite family completely abandoned him. The fate of my parents and my golden child sister was equally devastating. The county sheriff officially padlocked the massive iron gates of their luxury estate, forcing them to vacate the premises. The bank seized their luxury cars, their expensive jewelry, and their frozen accounts to cover the massive debts Julian accumulated. They were forced to move into a tiny, rundown two-bedroom apartment in a dangerous neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Vanessa had to sleep on a cheap, lumpy sofa in the cramped living room, while my parents squeezed into a tiny bedroom that constantly smelled of damp mold. Valerie had to pawn the few remaining pearls from her broken necklace just to buy cheap groceries. Richard had to take a minimum wage job as a security guard. I know exactly how far they have fallen because my security team monitors their basic movements to ensure they never come near my corporate headquarters. They try to call me every single day using cheap burner phones. They leave desperate, pathetic voicemails crying about how cold their apartment is and begging me to forgive them for the past. They plead for me to send them just a few $100s to survive. But every single time they dial my private number, they hear the same automated message telling them the line has been permanently disconnected. I never listen to their voicemails. They are completely trapped in crushing poverty. I am standing on the glass balcony of my luxury penthouse feeling the cool breeze. Miles is standing beside me, wrapping his arms around my waist and resting his chin on my shoulder. We look out over the glittering lights of the city skyline. The towering glass skyscraper of Apex Health Partners stands brilliantly in the center of the financial district, an undeniable monument to my survival. Society constantly tries to force us into forgiving toxic people simply because they share our DNA. People will tell you that blood is thicker than water and that you have to endure their abuse. But that is an absolute lie designed to keep victims chained. Family is supposed to be the rich soil that helps you grow and protects you from the harsh storms of life. But sometimes that soil is completely poisoned with deep jealousy, conditional love, and toxic narcissism. If you stay planted in poisoned soil, you will inevitably wither and die. Sometimes the absolute only way to truly bloom is to take a sharp blade and completely sever the rotting roots tying you down. Cutting off my parents and my sister was the most painful decision I ever made, but it was the exact decision that saved my life. I stopped begging for a seat at their toxic table and built my own multi-billion-dollar empire instead. I realized my inherent worth was never defined by the ignorant people who were entirely blind to my actual value. If you are listening to this and you are currently struggling with a toxic family member who constantly makes you feel small, completely drains your energy, or uses you as a stepping stone, please know that you possess the power to walk away. You do not owe anyone your absolute peace of mind. The best revenge you can achieve is not screaming or fighting back. The best revenge is simply walking away, healing your deep wounds, and building a massive, untouchable success they can never reach. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. If this resonated with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs it. Stay strong, stay completely untouchable, and always remember to choose yourself first.